The teenagers were laughing at him again, mocking the way he stood too straight, walked too careful, checked corners like a paranoid old man. The mall security guard just smiled and kept his rounds. What they didn't know was that in exactly 7 minutes when the armed robbery started, they'd understand why he moved that way. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this story of hidden strength and quiet service, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe veterans deserve our respect, not our mockery, hit that subscribe button. Frank Garrett had been working security at Westfield Shopping Center in San Diego for 3 years. Same shift, same route, same polyester uniform that never quite fit right around his shoulders. At 65, with gray stubble and a slight limp in his left leg, he was just another old man earning minimum wage to supplement his pension. That's what everyone thought. The mall opened at 10 a.m., but Frank arrived at 8:30, always 8:30. He'd walk the perimeter first, not the lazy stroll most guards did, but a deliberate patrol, eyes scanning, checking exits, noting which doors were propped open, which cameras had blind spots. The younger guards thought he was paranoid. The maintenance crew thought he was weird. The store managers thought he was thorough. Only Frank knew he was just doing what 30 years of Force Recon had burned into his muscle memory. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Frank checked in at the security office, poured black coffee into his thermos, no sugar, no cream, just like the field, and began his rounds. The mall was quiet, just employees setting up their stores, the soft echo of footsteps on polished floors. At Spencer's, the sporting goods store, a group of teenagers was already loitering. School was out for spring break, and they'd been coming around all week. There were 4 of them. Josh, the loudmouth with the backwards cap, Tyler, always on his phone, Mason, trying to look tough in his older brother's Letterman jacket, and Connor, quiet but always watching. "Yo, here comes RoboCop," Josh announced as Frank approached. The others snickered. Frank kept walking, same measured pace, left foot, right foot, weight distributed, ready to pivot, just like Fallujah, just like Kandahar, just like a dozen other places these kids couldn't find on a map. "Damn, look at him," Tyler laughed, mimicking Frank's walk. "Checking corners like there's terrorists in the food court." "Probably thinks someone's going to steal a pretzel," Mason added. Frank paused at the corner, did his visual check, a quick sweep that took in all 4 exits, the service corridor, the camera positions. To the kids, it looked like paranoia. To anyone who'd served, it looked like survival. "Have a good morning, gentlemen," Frank said, his voice calm, even. He'd learned long ago that the best way to handle mockery was to give it nothing to feed on. "Whatever, old man," Josh called after him. "Try not to hurt yourself walking." Frank continued on. Corner check, sector clear, move forward. Behind him, Connor watched differently than his friends. Something about the way the old guard moved. Something about the way he held his shoulders. Something familiar. Frank finished his morning rounds and was heading back to the security office when he noticed a man in the food court, mid-30s, clean cut, sitting alone but not eating. The man's eyes tracked everyone who passed. His jacket was loose, could hide anything. His table gave him clear sightlines to 3 exits. Frank slowed his pace, angled his approach to keep a pillar between them, just another paranoid old guard. Except his hand had already clicked the safety off his radio, and his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet. The man looked up, met Frank's eyes across the court. For a moment, they just studied each other. Then the man smiled, not friendly, just acknowledging. He stood, left his unopened drink on the table, and walked toward the north exit. Frank followed at a distance, not obviously, just adjusting his route. The man glanced back once, saw Frank still there, and picked up his pace. By the time Frank reached the exit, the man was gone. No vehicle in sight, like smoke. Frank keyed his radio. "Unit 1 to base. North exit clear. Suspicious individual left the premises. White male, 30s, black jacket. No incident." "Copy that, Unit 1, came the bored reply. "Probably just another weirdo." Frank didn't respond. In Force Recon, they had a saying, "The one you see isn't the one that gets you." He spent the next hour running new patterns, checking blind spots he'd noted but never worried about before. Because that man in the food court, he'd moved like a hunter, and hunters rarely hunted alone. At 11:47 a.m., Frank was near the west entrance when he saw them. 3 men entering together but spreading out immediately. Same loose jackets, same careful walk.
Same eyes that saw everything while looking at nothing. His radio crackled. "Unit 1, we've got a report of suspicious individuals near Spencer's. Can you check it out?" Spencer's, where the kids were still hanging out. Frank moved, not running. Running drew attention, but that steady, ground-eating pace that had carried him through miles of hostile territory. As he rounded the corner, he saw Tyler outside the store, filming something on his phone. Inside, through the glass storefront, Josh and Mason were trying on sunglasses, laughing. Connor stood apart, and when he saw Frank approaching, something in the old guard's face made him step back. "Get behind me," Frank said quietly, not asking, ordering. "What?" Connor started to say, but Frank was already pushing past him into the store. The first man was at the counter, hand inside his jacket. The second was by the shoe section, watching the door. The third hadn't entered yet. He'd be outside, watching for police. 27 years of muscle memory kicked in. Frank's hand found the heavy aluminum flashlight on his belt, standard security equipment, but in trained hands, much more. He moved along the sunglasses display, using the mirrors to track positions. The clerk, a young woman named Sarah, was frozen behind the register. "Sir, can I help you?" Frank called out, voice carrying that particular tone of bored authority. The man at the counter turned. "Just browsing, Pops." "Store policy," Frank continued, closing distance. "No loitering. Either make a purchase or move along." The man's hand started to come out of his jacket. Frank saw the shape, the weight of it, the way it pulled the fabric. In one motion, he brought the flashlight up and across. Not a wild swing, controlled, precise, catching the man's wrist just as the gun cleared leather. The weapon clattered across the floor. The second man moved, reaching for his own weapon. Frank was already turning, using the first man's body as a shield, driving him backward into his partner. They went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. The third man burst through the door, gun already out. Frank dropped, rolled behind the counter, came up with the first man's fallen weapon in a perfect Weaver stance. "Drop it," Frank said. Calm, steady. The voice of a man who'd said those words before in much worse places. The third man hesitated. In that hesitation, he was already beaten. Because Frank didn't hesitate, never had. The gun in his hands was rock steady, his breathing controlled, his finger indexed along the trigger guard exactly where 27 years of training had taught him to keep it until he was ready to kill. "I said, drop it." The gun clattered to the floor. "On the ground, hands behind your head, interlace your fingers." By the time mall security arrived 2 minutes later, they found 3 men prone on the floor, restrained with the plastic cuffs Frank had convinced management to let him carry. "Just in case," he'd said. The old security guard was sitting on an overturned shopping basket, calmly giving a description to 911 dispatch. The kids stood in a cluster by the door. Josh's mouth hung open. Tyler had stopped filming, his phone hanging loose in his hand. Mason looked like he might be sick, but Connor stepped forward. "Sir," he said quietly, "that was... How did you..." Frank looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Saw something familiar in the kid's eyes. That hunger to understand, to be more than ordinary. "Your dad serve?" Frank asked. "Marines, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. He died in Helmand when I was 12. Frank nodded slowly. "Good unit. I worked with him in '08. Good Marines. Were you?" "Force Recon. 1st Force Reconnaissance Company. Long time ago. But you still remember." Frank stood, his knee protesting slightly. "Son, you don't forget. You just learned to carry it different." The police arrived in a flood of uniforms and questions. The 3 men were part of a crew that had hit 6 malls across 3 states. Armed robbery, assault, 2 deaths in Memphis. The FBI had been tracking them for months. "How do you know?" Detective Morrison asked Frank later, after the statements and photographs and evidence bags. Frank shrugged. They moved wrong. Moved wrong? Hunters trying to look like shoppers, but hunters can't help checking exits, watching mirrors, keeping their strong hand free. Little things. Morrison stared at him. You saw all that? I saw what I was trained to see. And the takedown? 3 armed men? They were sloppy, overconfident, probably worked fine against civilians. But you're not a civilian. Frank smiled then, just slightly. Detective, once you've earned the title Marine, you're never really a civilian again. The story hit the news that night. Elderly mall guard stops armed robbery. The headlines didn't capture it, though. Didn't capture the precision, the economy of movement, the absolute calm under fire. But the surveillance footage did, every second of it. The video went viral, not because of the violence, but because of the competence. The way Frank moved, the way he controlled space, the way 3 armed criminals became zero threat in less than 8 seconds. By morning, Frank's phone was ringing. Reporters, publishers, talk shows. He answered none of them. Instead, he showed up for his shift at 8:30, same as always. Same polyester uniform, same slight limp, same careful walk. But something had changed at the mall. The store employees nodded with respect now. The maintenance crew watched him with something approaching awe. And security? They started walking their rounds different, checking corners, watching exits, trying to see what Frank saw. The teenagers came back that afternoon, quieter now. Josh approached first, his usual swagger gone.
But we should have respected. I mean, even if you weren't... Son, Frank interrupted gently, respect isn't about what someone was. It's about how they carry themselves now. You learn that. That's enough. Tyler stepped forward. Could you teach us? The way you saw them? The way you knew? Frank studied the 4 boys, really studied them, saw Josh's bravado masking insecurity, Tyler's phone addiction replacing real connection, Mason trying to fill his brother's shoes, and Connor. Connor had his father's eyes. I run a class, Frank said finally, Saturdays, 0600 hours, situational awareness, basic defense, nothing fancy. 0600? Mason groaned. That's 6 a.m., civilian, Connor translated, grinning. We'll be there, Josh said quickly. All of us. Frank nodded. First lesson's free. After that, you earn it. Earn it how? Community service. 20 hours. Veterans Home on 5th Street, down in Chula Vista. They need people to listen to their stories. The boys exchanged glances. Deal, Connor said for all of them. That Saturday, 12 people showed up for Frank's class. The 4 teenagers, 3 mall employees, 2 single mothers, 3 college students, all wanting to learn to see the world through different eyes. Frank started simple. Awareness isn't paranoia. It's not about being afraid. It's about being present. Most people walk through life in condition white, completely unaware. That's where victims live. He taught them Cooper's color codes: white, unaware; yellow, relaxed awareness; orange, specific alert; red, fight. I live in yellow, Frank explained, have for 37 years. Not stressed, not paranoid, just aware. That's why I saw them. They were in orange, trying to look white. Oil and water. Week after week, the class grew. Frank taught them to read body language, to trust instincts, to see exits not as paranoia, but as options. He taught them the difference between cover and concealment, between aggressive and defensive positioning, between real threats and perceived ones. But more than tactics, he taught them mindset, the quiet confidence that came from preparation, the calm that came from acceptance, the strength that came from service to something larger than yourself. Connor became his star student. The boy absorbed everything, asked the right questions, pushed himself harder than the rest. One morning after class, he stayed behind. Mr. Garrett, he said, I've been thinking about enlisting, Marines, like my dad. Frank sat on the gym bench, considering his words carefully. Your dad would be proud either way. But make sure you're doing it for you, not for him. The Corps will take everything you've got and ask for more. You need your own reasons to give it. Did you have reasons? Frank smiled. I was young. Thought I was tough. Pendleton showed me I wasn't. Then Recon made me better than I imagined. But the real reason? I stayed because of the men beside me. Everything else, the missions, the medals, the glory, that all fades. But the brothers you make, that's forever. Connor nodded, understanding more than his years should allow. Is that why you still do this, the mall job? Someone needs to watch, Frank said simply. Someone needs to stand between the wolves and the sheep. Doesn't matter if it's in Fallujah or a shopping mall. The mission doesn't end just because you take off the uniform. 6 months later, at Connor's Marine graduation from MCRD San Diego, Frank stood in the crowd. No dress blues. He'd never been one for reunions or ceremonies. Just a quiet man in khakis and a polo shirt watching another generation step forward. After the ceremony, Connor found him. Dress blues crisp, cover perfect, standing tall. Private Rodriguez reporting, sir, he said, saluting. Frank returned the salute, then pulled the young Marine into an embrace. Your dad would be proud, son. Hell, I'm proud. I wouldn't be here without you. No, Frank corrected. You were always going to be here. I just helped you see the path. He handed Connor a small box. Inside was a Force Recon challenge coin, worn smooth from decades of carrying. My platoon sergeant gave me that in '91 when I passed selection, Frank said. Told me to pass it on when I found someone worthy. That's you, Marine. Connor's eyes misted. I'll honor it, sir. I know you will. Now get out there and make some stories of your own. Frank returned to the mall the next week. Same shift, same route, same polyester uniform. But the teenagers who laughed at him were gone, replaced by young men who understood that strength came in many forms. The staff who ignored him now sought his advice. The community that never noticed him now knew that heroes didn't always wear capes or uniforms. They sometimes wore polyester and walked with a slight limp, checking corners not from paranoia but from purpose. Because Frank Garrett had learned long ago that the mission never really ended. It just changed shape. From hunting enemies in distant deserts to teaching awareness in a local gym. From leading Marines through hostile territory to guiding teenagers toward better paths. From carrying a rifle to carrying wisdom. The mall closed at 9 p.m., but Frank always stayed until 9:30, walking the empty corridors one last time, checking corners, watching exits, standing guard. Not because he had to anymore, but because once a warrior, always a warrior. And warriors, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and share your story of meeting a hidden hero. Because at The Human Stories, we believe that true strength isn't loud. It doesn't boast. It doesn't demand recognition. It just shows up every day and stands watch. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Help us honor those who serve in silence, who protect without praise, who prove that heroes don't always look like heroes. They sometimes look like old men in polyester uniforms, walking carefully through a mall, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing. Until next time, remember, respect everyone you meet. You never know who they used to be, and more importantly, you never know who they still are.